Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. A very warm good evening to all of you and welcome to another episode in the series of Explained. Today we are going to discuss about the topic climate justice. Now this topic and this whole issue of climate justice is something which has been around for a long time now. But then in the past week when India hosted John Kerry, the United States Special Envoy for Climate, this issue again came back up into the spotlight. So here we shall be analyzing what do we mean exactly when we use the term climate justice. We shall be analyzing the different aspects as well as different attributes that you can associate with this term. Along with that, we shall also be taking a brief overview about the discourse that has prevailed along the globe across the various different countries on this particular topic. So let us first of all understand this term climate justice. What do we mean by that? So as you can see, it is not just a term but actually a kind of a movement where we get an idea that climate change and global warming which is impacting the planet actually tends to impact the underprivileged and the backward classes of the society in a disproportionate manner. What do we mean by that? In a layman's term, that gives us an idea that any sort of climate change is going to always impact the downtrodden at a greater degree. How is that? So basically, if we analyze how does climate change and how does global warming impact us all, the answer is right before us. So when you talk about all the low-lying countries of the world, along with all the countries which share a long coastline, for example, India, for example, Bangladesh, if you take a look at the demography or the population distribution which exists along the coastlines of these countries, we arrive at one basic conclusion, that the coastal areas typically are dominated by the underprivileged sections of the society. Because right next to the sea coast is where the land is very, very cheap and you will find shanties as well as hutments in a form of unestablished settlement. So, as a result of global warming, what happens? The seawater is rising across the globe. Due to that particular factor, all these low-lying areas, they stand on the verge of being submerged. The Sundarbans Delta, which we so proudly refer to as the largest delta which exists across the world, that Sundarbans Delta is actually getting submerged day by day, month after month, and year after year. So submergence of these areas poses a direct threat to the living spaces of these underprivileged sections of the society. But along with that, you also have millions of hectares of farmland and agricultural land on the verge of being destroyed. So that leaves those people at a very dire situation. And when you talk about the affluent section of the society, the affluent people, so-called well-off section of the society, they can obviously take care of themselves. But then, not only is the submergence an important part. If you talk about the other impact of this global warming or this climate change, then we have observed that the rainfall patterns across the globe, let alone in India, they have become more and more erratic. You will observe that suddenly there are bouts of increased rainfall, and that is followed by prolonged period of absolute drought-like conditions. Due to this, what happens? As a direct impact, it leads to crop failures. And these crop failures are being observed across various seasons. It is not as if these crop failures are being observed only during the summer or the winter months or only along certain parts of the world. This is actually a problem which is prevalent across the globe. And when these crops tend to fail, which is the section of society which gets impacted? It is the farmers, the agricultural laborers, the landless people, and they get impacted to the greatest degree. So these two factors, combined with other different evidences that we have, that shows us that it is indeed the underprivileged section of the society which is impacted. Now let us take the example of India, and let us talk about India's specific problems and how it is that these underprivileged people, they are impacted in our country. So when you take a look around yourself, any kind of floodplains of any river, you will observe that along the banks of these floodplains, very close to the river, again you will find shanties and again unorganized settlements and hutments, which are again occupied by the lower strata of the society in terms of economic as well as social backwardness. Now, due to this global warming, the rivers have reacted in a very different way. Suddenly, you will observe the water level in the river starts rising, and it leads to unprecedented floods. Again, which is the section which gets impacted? It is the people who live on the banks of these rivers, and they get impacted the most because their livelihoods, their spaces to live, so-called habitats, they stand on the verge of being destructed. But along with that, we again have a potential for a much larger problem which stands right before us. Due to an overall increased temperature which is prevailing across the globe, various different kinds of diseases are also prevalent. For example, in the earlier times, before this period of global warming and the sudden and rapid climate change, before that, the diseases such as malaria, dengue, chikungunya, and so on, they had a very specific timeline and a very specific season throughout the year when they used to impact us. But now, as the overall average temperature has increased to such a great degree, the danger of contacting these diseases has increased like never before. So overall, the world is exposed to newer problems. And all these issues that we are talking about, the climate justice, the issue about the underprivileged being impacted more, why is that happening? That is happening as a result of the global warming, which has been initiated to a certain degree due to the increased amount of emissions that we end up giving up into the atmosphere. So you would see that this whole global warming and the greenhouse effect that always comes into discussion whenever we talk about climate change. What is it all about? So think about it from a layman's perspective. So suppose any vehicle that you are riding on or any industrial plant nearby your home, all of them have their own sets of emissions. Now these emissions can be anything. These emissions can be in the form of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, so on and so forth. All these emissions and all these gases, they form a part of the greenhouse gases. Now what these greenhouse gases actually do is, they remain suspended into the atmosphere for a long period of time. And as and when the earth is released from the, or as and when the heat is released from the earth's surface, what happens is, this particular heat is entrapped by these gases or these emissions. So what happens? More amount of emissions that we have, more amount of heat is being trapped by the earth's atmosphere. So there is a direct correlation. So that is why the whole world has been clamoring about reduction in the emissions that we end up carrying out on a day-to-day basis. And the impact of these greenhouse gases and an increased emission on the planet has been destabilizing, to say the least. If you talk about various different regions of the world, none of the region is more impacted than the polar or the Arctic region. So those areas which earlier used to be under the permanent cover of thick sheets of ice, those areas have been witnessing a kind of a meltdown. And that is something which has fueled back the heating cycle. Let me explain how. So in the first image that you see basically a thick covering of ice. Now what happens is, when you have sunlight and this sunlight falls on this ice sheet, ice ends up reflecting the maximum amount of light that falls on it. As a result of it, the overall temperature is always maintained at a lower degree. Why is that? Because the ice has already reflected maximum amount of heat that has fallen upon it. Now, due to global warming, what is happening? These ice sheets are melting in certain places. Now, when you have ice sheets which are melting, that means water is exposed directly to the sunlight, and water absorbs more sunlight in comparison to ice. So when you have a large water body close to an ice sheet, then that particular water will not reflect that much amount of sunlight, but will rather end up absorbing most of it. And as a result of that, what will happen? The temperature in the surrounding regions will rise. The temperature rise will lead to more ice melting further, and more ice melting further shall lead to more water getting exposed. So it is kind of a vicious cycle, where you will see that the cycle starts with the melting of ice. As the ice melts, water is exposed, leading to overall temperature rise because of more absorption of heat, again leading to more melting of ice. And due to this, the polar regions, and more specifically the Arctic region, is heating at an unprecedented rate. And this is a phenomena which has also been referred to as polar amplification or Arctic amplification. But then, along with that, when you go to the higher latitudes, for example, in the regions around the northern part of Siberia, you have vast expanses which were earlier covered under a very thick sheet of permafrost or a permanent ice cover. Now, beneath these thick sheets of permafrost actually lied forests which were buried a long time ago. So due to that, what happened? These forests, they lied entrapped within the outer envelope of ice. But again, due to global warming, these ice sheets are melting. As a result, it is exposing everything which lies buried underneath it. Everything. Be it forest cover, be it soil, everything is exposed to the atmosphere. But then, how does that pose a danger to the climate? Here is where we have to understand an important concept. Whenever you have trees or forested areas which get buried, they end up trapping a significant amount of carbon along with them. So, when these are then exposed to the outer atmosphere, there is always a risk of release of excessive amount of carbon dioxide or other forms of carbon back into the atmosphere. And that is released in the form of greenhouse gas. So, as a result of this, whenever you see that there is a permafrost layer or a peatland, here peatland refers to these buried forests. whenever any of them get buried and later they get exposed to the atmosphere, they end up losing quite a significant amount of carbon in the form of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that exaggerates global warming to a significant extent. Now, along with that, you also have an impact which is felt on the species, the living flora and fauna across the globe. So, different animals, they end up experiencing a shrinking habitat. A shrinking habitat in terms of what? Their living spaces are decreasing by the day. The areas which they called as home, that has probably melted away, or there the climate has changed to such a degree that they are forced to migrate. But then this migration is not only observed in the animals. Even we humans have been migrating due to the climate change. That is why, under the latest New York Declaration for Migrants, climate migrants was included as a separate category. Why is that? Because it was found that across various countries of the globe, be it the countries in the Middle East, countries such as Syria, countries such as Iraq, or countries in Southeast Asian nations such as Bangladesh. Here, people have had to migrate because the climate change is influencing their ways and means of livelihood. So as I said, and as we have already discussed, that the rising and overall increase in sea level has put various different farmlands at a greater risk. Most of them, which are in the low-lying areas, they are on the verge of submergence. And there is salty water from the sea which actually penetrates these farmlands, rendering them unfit for any agricultural activity. So that is why, even amongst us humans, we have been witnessing a surge in climatic migrants. And this is a term which is important, which refers to people who are migrating from one place to another due to climate change. Now, due to this warming or due to this overall temperature change, there has been a clamor call, or there has been an overall voice which has risen across the globe for a long period of time now to say that please take a hold of it. Let us take a stock, let us take a pause, and then let us analyze how and when the temperature is rising. Because the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is basically a scientific body which gives advisories and recommendations based on all the scientific researches and scientific evidences that they have regarding climate change. So IPCC has said that if we go on abusing our atmosphere and abusing our planet like we are doing now, then the planet as we know it shall be substantially different by the year 2100. So IPCC basically has set a target of around 1.5 to 2 degrees C rise in temperature when compared to pre-industrial revolution era. Why is it that we always compare it to pre-industrial revolution era? That is because as and when industrial revolution actually affected our lives, since that point of time, the rate of global warming and the rate of climate change has been unprecedented and exponential, to say the least. So that is why all the effort around the globe has been to restrict this increase of temperature. Now here, the important aspect or the important trivia that we have to note is what do we mean and what is IPCC. So oftentimes you get a question from this, that IPCC is or when was it formed? So basically it was created in 1988 and it was created by the joint effort of WMO or World Meteorological Organization along with the United Nations Environment Program. Both these organizations, they were pivotal in forming the IPCC. And it was this IPCC which has played an instrumental role in not only influencing the governmental decisions across the globe, but also raising the awareness level amongst the general class of population. And all the findings of IPCC are backed by strong scientific evidences and researches. So that is why IPCC is one of the credible names that you will come across in this discourse of climate change. Now, after having said that, how has the world responded to this issue of climate change? So the world for a long period of time now has known the risk and the danger of global warming and climate change. And various different parts of the world, they have reacted in a different way. When you talk about the developed section of the world or the developed countries, so-called developed nations of the world, they have basically in the initial period, they shrugged it off. And they shrugged it off as a conspiracy theory. But then sane minds prevailed. And it was in 1992 at a summit in Rio de Janeiro where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And this was the first concrete step or the first concrete measure which was taken to combat the issue of global warming and climate change. And since 1992, various different steps have been taken, but each and every step comes under the overarching umbrella of UNFCCC. Now, after that, very regularly, that is on an yearly interval, various different countries which are party to this UNFCCC, they actually come together in what is referred to as a conference of parties, and thereby they stand to discuss that what are the developments that we have taken, what are the improvements that need to be catered to, and what is the status overall when you talk about this climate change. Now, this conference of parties has brought about a semblance or a stability in the movement to combat climate change. The first major milestone was achieved when the Kyoto Protocol was actually enforced. So Kyoto Protocol was basically signed on 11th of December 1997. It came into force in 2005. There were various different intervening steps in between. For example, it was at the Conference of Parties 7, that is, which was held in 2001 in the country of Morocco. There, in the city of Marrakesh, was where you had the Conference of Parties. It was in Marrakesh that it was decided what should be the exact rules and what should be the exact implementation guidelines that one has to follow in the case of Kyoto Protocol. Similarly, it was there in Marrakesh where the first commitment period, that was from 2008 to 2012, was agreed upon. In this protocol, it was agreed that 6 major gases, which are the 6 major gases? So the 6 major gases of CO2, that is carbon dioxide, methane or CH4, nitrous oxide or N2O, hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs, perfluorocarbon or PFCs, as well as sulfur hexafluoride or SF6. It was agreed that emissions of these 6 gases shall be curbed upon. And all the developed nations of the world, they shall take a lead in this regard. And that is what was followed in the first commitment period. Obviously, when you single out the developed nations of the world, there was going to be some amount of backlash. And the so-called developed nations of the world, they shrugged their responsibility immediately and they said that it is unfair to them. Again, you had various different conference of parties, and thereby at Doha in Qatar, you had the second commitment period, which was actually established between 2013 to 2020. Now, this Kyoto Protocol is known for many different nuances, many different details and achievements. But one of the major achievements of this Kyoto Protocol was the term common but differentiated responsibility. What did this signify? Well, it fixed the responsibility of all these emissions and all the existent greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It fixed the responsibility for all of that for and into the developed countries of the world. It stated very clearly that it was the developed countries of the world which were responsible for all these leading emissions, because it were these countries which have been industrialized for a very long time. The so-called underdeveloped or developing nations of the world, like India, like China, like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, they did not experience industrialization for a long period of time. So that is why they could not have been the contributors of all the emissions and all the pollutants which are deeply exaggerating the issue of climate change and global warming. So this issue of common but differentiated responsibility, it not only made a statement to the developed nations, but it also lent forward a helping hand to the developing and the underdeveloped nations. Because under its provisions or under the provisions of Kyoto Protocol was mentioned that the developed countries of the world should help out the developing or the underdeveloped nations by financial measures or by transfer of technology, so that even these countries have the required technology by which they can combat climate change. So this was something which died with Kyoto Protocol, because after Kyoto came the Paris Agreement. Now the Paris Agreement, which was signed under a lot of fanfare and lots of excitement in the year 2015, was actually an agreement which envisaged a world beyond the targets which had been set by the Kyoto Protocol. So under the Paris Agreement, all the different countries were supposed to give their own INDC, or intended nationally determined contributions. What does that mean? That means all the different countries were supposed to bring about their own specific set of targets. That what is it that they intended to achieve in the time period of 5 to 10 years. So under this agreement, each and every country was supposed to submit their own INDC in the interval of 5 to 10 years. The only requirement was that these countries should fulfill the targets that they have set for themselves. And thereby, after 5 years or after 10 years, they have to set a more aggressive target for themselves. So that is the whole point or the aspiration behind the Paris Agreement. And it is something which came into force, or actually it came under implementation since this year or 2021 itself. So Paris Agreement very beautifully and very tactfully changed the whole discourse from common but differentiated responsibility to an individual responsibility and INDC. No longer was the developed world responsible for all the emissions. No longer was the developed world supposed to take care or handhold the poorer nations of the world. And that brought about the inequality for the glare of the world. Now, when you talk about India and India's own INDC, so India actually decided to be a front runner or to lead by example. So that is why India set very ambitious targets for itself. And India is the only country amongst all the G20 nations of the world which actually is standing tall on its target and which is supposed and is well on its way to achieve those targets way before 2030, which has been the deadline for the country. So we as a nation not only set very ambitious targets, but we are well on our way to achieve that. So basically you will see that India actually committed to improve the emissions intensity by close to around 33 to 35% by 2030. Also, India pledged to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in generation of electricity to almost around 40%. Also, along with that, India pioneered keeping France as a major partner to establish what we refer to as the International Solar Alliance, which has truly revolutionized solar energy across the globe, making it accessible and affordable like never before. So, if India is being a responsible global citizen, then why is it that climate justice is being talked about? Well, the reason is when you look at the emissions, then data can be presented in a certain way. So if you take a look at this pie chart basically gives you an idea about the emissions that are actually carried out by various countries of the world. You will observe that China occupies one of the highest emissions and is responsible for 28% of the emissions which are observed across the globe. United States, on the other hand, is responsible for 15% of the emissions. European Union is also responsible for a great amount of emissions. But then, another important player, that is India is responsible for 7% of the emissions. So again, the global spotlight was actually shining on India. And each and every developed country of the world gave the example of India. You would remember very famously the previous United States president, that is Donald Trump. He used to ridicule India's efforts to mitigate climate change because he said that India is one of the leading emitters of all these greenhouse gases in the world and is still very poor. So it was a mockery of all of India's efforts and all of India's ambitions to lift millions of people out of poverty. So that is where the data pointers, they stand against India. That you cannot end up emitting close to around 7% of the overall emissions and still talk about being an underdeveloped or a developing nation. But then, as is the case with each and every example, there is another side to the coin. And that is when you consider per capita emissions. What are these per capita emissions? So per capita emissions are when the overall emissions carried out by any country is taken with respect to the population of that country. So thereby we account for how much is the emission when each and every individual is taken into account. So when you take the data for per capita emissions, the result is very glaring. Because there you will see that an average American leads to an emission of close to around 14.95 metric tons, whereas an average Indian will lead to only around 1.57 tons. So that tells you a different story altogether. That unsustainable way of life, which is prevalent in most of the developed nations of the world, that has given them the luxury to have emissions at such a great degree that we Indians can never match up to it. And that is where India puts its case forward. That it is fine that we are the fourth largest emitters in the world after China, United States, European Union. But that it is also true that when you take into account our large and burgeoning population and their individual needs and demands, we are doing much better than the developed nations. So this was the viewpoint, and this has been the viewpoint that India has been putting forward since the Kyoto negotiations. But then, as you can guess, whenever you have multiple opinions and many different interests on the table, what arises out of it? Politics. And that is where international climate politics is at play at a degree that is unprecedented. And all of that clamor call, all of that talk about doing something for the climate, taking a step forward to mitigate climate change is being done keeping an eye on 26th Conference of Parties, which is going to be held this year in the city of Glasgow. Now, please let us understand what is this climate politics that I'm talking about. So recently, United States has had a fresh election. Joe Biden was elected as the US president. Now Joe Biden is trying desperately hard to take United States back to the leadership position when it comes to the discourse around climate change. So United States or America wants to set an example before the world that, see, by the time of 26 COP, I have made all the parties in agreement, or I have brought all of them on the negotiating table, and thereby we have been talking about something which is referred to as net zero emission, or which is also referred to as carbon neutrality. What is this carbon neutrality? That is something we shall be paying attention to. But then why is this that net zero emissions and carbon neutrality suddenly out of nowhere have come in focus? That is because recently China has announced that its emissions shall be peaking by the year 2030, and China shall attain carbon neutrality status by the year 2060. Now this is an ambitious target. And as is the case with China, you cannot rely on the targets that they set for themselves. But then this has set the ball rolling, where globally discussions have started that when do we attain the net zero status or carbon neutrality. So when you talk about countries such as China, China is already expecting its population to peak by the year 2024. Thereafter, China's population is going to stabilize before declining a bit. So it has achieved most of the economic upliftment that it had to for the billions of its population. But when you talk about the country that is India, or various different countries such as India, where we still have miles to go before true amelioration of the downtrodden has taken place, there attaining carbon neutrality is a pipe dream. So that is where the whole climate politics comes into picture. On one hand, you have India, which stands very, very firm that, see, we are true to our INDC, which we have declared on Paris, and maybe we are going to exceed that target. Not only that, we are leading by example, and we have set up the International Solar Alliance, which after some period of time has greatly reduced the cost of solar power across the world. So India stands firm on its own path, but then the world around it is pressurizing India to declare a net zero emission target. On April 22nd and 23rd, there is going to be a virtual climate summit which is going to be headed by Joe Biden or the US President. It is there that it is expected that US will also come up with its own net zero emission target. That is why his special envoy for climate, that is John Kerry, visited India and was trying to nudge the Indian government to reach this zero emission target. So this net zero emission, carbon neutrality, what is it that we are talking about? What do we mean by net zero emissions? Does that mean that your vehicle should no longer emit any smoke? Does that mean your industries should be completely emissionless? No. When we talk about net zero emissions, it is not about having no emissions at all, but rather whatever you are giving up into the atmosphere, whatever is emitted into the atmosphere, if you have the technology and ability to put that back into the ground surface, that is when you achieve carbon neutrality or the state of net zero emissions. For example, let us take the case of India. Let us suppose, for example, that India emits close to around 450 metric tons of emission. Right? But out of this 450 tons, if due to the various different forests, due to the presence of various artificial sequestration measures, if India is able to put back all this carbon that has been emitted back into the ground, it is then that we can truly say that India has achieved carbon neutrality. That is what is meant by net zero emissions. Now, in certain cases, what happens is, for example, if you take the country of Bhutan. Now, we are all aware that Bhutan is not very industrialized. It lags behind on the scale of manufacturing and industrialization. But then, Bhutan has a very large green cover. So, due to these particular factors, what happens is, whatever Bhutan ends up emitting, more than that is what is actually observed or absorbed by the trees and the ground itself. So in the case of Bhutan, what do we have? We have lesser number of or lesser amount of emissions and greater amount of carbon which is being pushed into the ground or being absorbed by the different plants and the forested areas. So not only is Bhutan carbon neutral or having a net zero emission status, but in a way it is carbon negative. That is something which different countries have to achieve. And that is where you will again come across the term which is referred to as negative emissions. Now, all these different places that we are talking about, that trees end up absorbing carbon dioxide. Some of the carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans as well. Most of the carbon dioxide is absorbed by various different soil types and different rocks as well. All of these are referred to as sinks. Now, these sinks can be natural, as is the case with oceans, as is the case with rocks and forests, or they can be absolutely artificial, depending upon whether they are created by man or whether it is present in the nature itself. For example, in the country of Iceland, what various geologists and scientists have done is they have trapped the carbon dioxide which is emitted that carbon dioxide is being trapped into thick sheets of ice as well as in underground caves and caverns. Even in Russia, it has been experimented where the carbon dioxide emissions are being forced back into the abandoned coal mines, so that after some period of time, that carbon dioxide will get converted automatically into coal gas and can be used as a fuel. But along with that, overall greenhouse gas presence in the atmosphere, that will also reduce. So all these man-made measures to deplete carbon dioxide in a way, or to remove the emissions and thereby deposit them or inject them in the surface of the rock or within the ice sheets or within the spent coal mines, all of these, they come under the category of artificial sink. Now, we had talked about the negative emissions as well. That is, when all these materials and all these different emissions, they are put back into the surface of the earth, that is what we refer to as the negative emissions. So by this image, you get an idea about the various different sources which act as the sources for negative emissions, or in a way, all those different areas where you will experience carbon dioxide being absorbed. So the first one is the case of oceans. Oceans, they are responsible for sequestering or absorbing close to around half of the carbon dioxide emissions across the globe. So that is why ocean fertilization, which is basically carried out by spraying certain iron particles, what that does is, it leads to a sudden spurt in the population of algal growth. And you know, algae is basically a plant species. Plants, they end up absorbing carbon dioxide and give out oxygen. So that is how oceans, they act as the sinks where carbon dioxide and different emissions can be stored. But along with that, you have biochar or biocharcoal. You have measures such as afforestation and reforestation. You have measures such as enhanced weathering, where you tend to break the rocks into many small pieces and thereby inject them within the soil particles themselves, thereby entrapping maximum amount of carbon dioxide. There is also air capture, that is, carbon dioxide is trapped directly from the atmosphere, as has been tried in the case of Iceland. And also, there is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where all the different emissions, in those emissions, carbon dioxide and methane is singled out, and from those you have a compressed gas which is manufactured, which can act as a source of fuel. So all these different techniques, technologies, as well as natural sources, they help in getting rid of the excess amount of carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere, that is leading to overall increased warming. Now, these are the steps that need to be taken by all the countries of the world, whichever is trying to attain net zero emission. So any country, be it China, be it United States, be it India, any country which declares tomorrow that I will be attaining net zero status, they will have to keep, or they will have to take these particular steps. Now, when you talk about India's position on this net zero emission status and the Paris Agreement, again, India's stand is very clear. India is arguing that let us stand true to our own declared contributions. Let us at least fulfill our own set targets. And then we shall be talking about net zero emissions. Let us not try to deviate the attention of the globe by taking an altogether different issue. Because as I have said, amongst all the G20 countries of the world, only India is the one country which is standing true to its obligations. Rest all of them have been shrugging their responsibility. So that is why it is very convenient for those countries to actually have a discussion on something else. That is where India sees a problem. And India is the only major country which is opposing this issue of net zero emissions. Because India knows that the next 30 to 40 years are very, very important or instrumental in deciding the future course of our country. Because in the next 30 to 40 years is when India has to undertake expansion in the sense of economy, in the sense of social parameters, in the sense of health indicators, basic facilities, everything. India has to bring millions of people out of the scourge of poverty. So that is where India knows that regardless of how much afforestation or reforestation program it carries out, it can never attain the net zero status in the coming 30 to 40 years. That is why India is reluctant for it. But along with that fact, we have another issue. We do not have the technical expertise in order to bring about path-breaking technological interventions which can mitigate these emissions. We don't have that technology for electric vehicles being applied on the common roads. We still don't have the modern emission technology which can make our thermal power plants more eco-friendly. And along with that, we need a huge amount of financial resource in order to have all the established manufacturing industry come up to the standard where we can talk about net zero emissions. So India, as of now, is lacking both finance as well as the technological know-how. And in both these cases, the developed nations of the world, which should actually, and all of them should have actually led by example, they are the ones who are standing as laggards. And as we speak, it was today that John Kerry announced that United States is going to bring lots and lots of private industries in terms of technological know-how which shall transfer their technology into Indian companies. Now that is still a pipe dream. How much of it shall turn into reality is something that we shall observe in the times to come. But as of now, India and the Indian government is standing at a crossroad. So what is the way forward? So first thing, we need financial and technological help. There are no two ways about it. But at the same time, we have to keep one thing in mind, that India as a country cannot lag behind. Because rest of the world, even if we don't take care of them, we in India ourselves have millions of people who are on the verge of having their whole lives destroyed because of this climate change. Already, we are witnessing the decreased agricultural output due to increased temperature. And decreased agricultural output means lowering of farm income. With a country where more than 55% of the population is involved in agriculture, that makes a very solid case why India should be a pioneer in establishing this technological know-how. But at the same time, we have to ensure that we uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Let's say we as Indians are able to take care of our own technology, of our own industries. But still, there are many island nations. There are many nations along the coastlines of Africa which have not developed to that degree. Those nations require financial help. And that financial help, that cannot be provided by India because India is not in a position to do so. So that is why not only does India have to play a role of a responsible global citizen, but also an advocate for the poor. And that is when we have to keep in mind that our own house is in order. Whenever we carry out construction of ultra large projects, very big projects, environmental impact assessment is something we have to carry out. Because unless and until we do that, we are risking the lives of each and every Indian that we know of. That is when climate justice shall be truly achieved and attained. So that is all that you need to know about the issue and the topic of climate justice. So in this video, what is it that we have learned? We have actually seen and started with understanding what is climate justice after all. And how is it, if at all, the issue that climate change tends to impact the underprivileged and the poorer sections of the society. Is that true? If yes, then what are the cases which prove that? After that, we have seen what do we mean by greenhouse gases and global warming. What is IPCC? We have looked at the global discourse around climate change. We started with Kyoto. We talked about Paris, and we talked about the various different climate politics that have prevailed since then. Meanwhile, we also talked about certain very important terms such as Arctic and polar amplification, along with discussing about climate migrants and climatic migration. And after that, we have discussed about what India's conundrum is. Why is it that India is hesitant to announce what the world wants it to announce? And we have also discussed what do we mean by net zero emission standards. That is all that we need to know. Thank you for being with us.